I mean, of course, we didn't expect a war.
In one way or other, it backfired.
Reform subsidies. Is that still possible?
All bets are off, right? If it does escalate, then perhaps the risks could outweigh the benefit.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of Beyond the Headlines. The go-to space for the top stories that made the headlines and more. I'm Amalina Kamal.
And I'm Juliana Jalaluddin.
Tensions in the Middle East have escalated sharply following the US and Israeli strikes that killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Right, and these attacks have triggered missile and drone retaliations across the Gulf. And airlines and shipping companies have been forced to halt operations through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical maritime routes.
Indeed. And Julie, global ramifications are quite significant because Brent crude oil has surged past 80 to 90 US dollars per barrel, which has left markets very unsettled, right?
Exactly. And that's the highest since June last year, mind you. So analysts have already started warning that the situation could escalate further. We don't know whether it's going to be a short-term or a long-term thing. We hope it's short-term for the benefit of everyone in the entire world. For Malaysia specifically, the implications are, quite immediate.
You've seen trade flows being disrupted, energy prices, rising, and I'm not too sure if it's going to continue to rise or it's going to break even in a sense whereby it's going to plateau until it resets itself. And industrial sectors having to look at new pressures and how they're going to navigate this.
Exactly. So now policymakers are forced to consider the impact on government revenue or fuel subsidies and also foreign investment.
And to help us unpack the geopolitical and economic ramifications here, we're joined by two guests that will help us, navigate the layers behind this particular attack. Not just the attack alone, but how it has this ripple effect towards the globe at large, right? First up to my left, we've got Dr. Ferooze Ali, who is a senior lecturer at University Sultan Zainal Abidin's Faculty of Law and International Study and an expert in Middle East geopolitics. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we also have Jaideep Singh, who's an analyst from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, who will help us give focus on economic resilience as we attempt to understand this crisis even better and what it means for Malaysian trade, energy, as well as the industrial competitiveness. Thank you so much, Jaideep, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to our gentlemen and I guess to everyone's watching, before we start, I think, I think the US-Israeli attack on Iran is not necessarily happened in a vacuum, right? Prior to that, there were talks of having to basically pressure how Iran's trajectory in terms of their nuclear development would be. And I thought, on Washington's side, they said, look, talks are going well. And unfortunately, a few days after that, then we saw the first strike in Tehran, right?
So that pivoted quite fast.
Yeah, it kind of escalated pretty quickly. And then a lot of people are also, leveraging on what the whole sort of push were to be. And initially, the push was to kind of replace the regime at hand because of this whole campaign of free Iran having to be mostly driven by the diaspora. But those who have observed the escalation in terms of the tensions within and externally know that there are a lot of factors at play there, right? First is basically Iran's position in the whole trade globally. And then second is basically the control of Straits of Hormuz, which in the past, with the whole pressure in Gaza, we saw a lot of, dissatisfaction coming from Israel, having to put a pressure on the US to put a stop in this basically resistance. Anyway, we talk about regional security first, right? Before we go into the immediate economic impact here. Dr. Ferooze, again, US and Israel having to strike deep in Iranian leadership and military command. But do you think this sort of decapitation strikes actually fundamentally alter regional power dynamics? Or do you think that it creates more instability that no actor can actually fully control?
Okay, let us start with the regional power balance. At this point of time, nothing has changed yet. There is two reasons for that. Number one is we are still seeing the Iranian military still firing barrages of missiles to Israel and also to the GCCs. So it tells us that IRGC is still functioning and operating. So the next factor, which is equally important, is the current governing structure of the Iranian government is still intact. This is despite the decapitation exercise that has been done by Israel and United States. Now, the earlier thinking from the policymakers in Tel Aviv and Washington is that if they are able to get rid of the highest leadership inside Iran, that will prompt
A transition of power.
a transition of power, an internal revolt, a defection within the military ranks, and also it will mobilize people to bring down the current government. These two things did not happen. Instead, what occurred is a national show of solidarity amongst Iranians. As at today, there's a huge demonstration for the support of the government and also to pledge their sympathy against the passing of Ayatollah Khamenei. So, in one way or other, it backfired on what Israel and America intended to.
Right.
So, when we talk about this destabilization, there's also a factor where we need to take into consideration, and that is the need to pay revenge from the Iranian government to show something to their people that we are doing something for the death of Ayatollah Khamenei.
Right.
Now, an emboldened Iran can destabilize further the Middle East. This is key. Now, what I see is that they will continuously fire their hypersonic missiles to these different GCCs. And that prompts another question, right? Could this kind of destabilization attract other actors into the theater? Now, Pakistan has actually conveyed a message recently suggesting that they have had a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia back in 2025, which would warrant them to protect Saudi Arabia if anything goes out of hand. Okay, so what does that mean? And secondly, about China. Okay, China has been importing Iranian crude oil between 80 to 89% at a price below the market price. Okay, so would China want to see the fall of Iran? Now that's
Seems
the
very
thing.
unlikely.
Yes. What are the odds, let's say, if the Iranian government, the current government falls and it's been replaced by a pro-West Iranian leadership? Most likely what is going to happen is they're going to divert the oil away from China.
Yeah.
So these are some of the intricacies that
Right.
we can
Russia
talk about.
made some noise. They issued a warning, didn't they? They said that if this continues, they will have to intervene and support Iran, if I'm not mistaken, right?
China,
Russia.
Russia.
Mm.
Well, at this juncture, I would think that it is still at the level of rhetoric, okay? Because I believe they wouldn't want to go head on with the United States for the reason Russia is having war with the Ukraine inside. Okay, they need to reserve their military or munition resources. They cannot spend everything on supporting Iran.
Right.
But before the war itself, they have actually helped Iran indirectly through their radar system and a few things. China provided the Beidou system. It is an alternative to GPS, which was created by United States. Beidou is the equivalent to GPS, but created by the Chinese government.
Right.
So it is a system which is hack-proof, I would say. So it's unable to be hacked by Western intelligence agencies.
Right.
So
I mean, okay, if we go with the whole, external pressures having to now focus itself on Iran because due to the retaliatory strikes, right? Because now it's attacking all the GCCs. We totally understood that in this particular context, China themselves has pressed Iran to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. And I believe I saw a report saying that, well, Iran has complied or still in discussion in terms of having to allow only Chinese counterparts to pass that particular route. Things are still, developing. We don't know what's certain. But when it comes to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Jaideep, we go to you. how vulnerable are Malaysia's own export-oriented industry in when we focus on the whole supply chain aspect, right?
Right. So I think from Malaysia's perspective, relatively speaking, in particular the export-oriented industries are not particularly exposed to the developments that are going on in the Straits of Hormuz, and this is because if we look at Malaysia's sort of trade profile, broader trade profile, our dependence on trade with the GCC and with Iran is fairly low in global terms. These countries only make up about 3 to 4% of Malaysia's total trade, and in fact, just about 3.5% of Malaysia's total trade does indirectly or in some way pass through the Straits of Hormuz. So the immediate sort of exposure of Malaysian trade to the developments is not that significant. And I think it's also important to highlight that Malaysia's biggest exports are in machinery and equipment, including semiconductors and other electrical equipment. A lot of these goods travel to other countries, to the rest of the world. Malaysia exports these products to the rest of the world via air freight rather than sea freight. And a lot of these trade flows do not involve the Strait of Hormuz at all. In fact, it's mostly to East Asia as well as to the Americas, and there are many other trade routes that are used instead of the Strait of Hormuz, and it doesn't even involve sea freight. So the immediate impact, I do not expect the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to have a direct immediate impact on Malaysia's export prospects. But in the long run, if the crisis continues to escalate, and if oil prices continue to rise, we could expect to see more pressure in terms of cost placed on Malaysian exporters, Malaysian businesses, Malaysian manufacturers, particularly in terms of energy prices, in terms of transportation costs. These the pressures could rise in the long run. But it's also again important to note that because Malaysia is a net fuel exporter, particularly of LNG, which is I think beyond crude oil that you mentioned earlier, one particular commodity that has been immediately impacted by the developments in the Middle East is liquefied natural gas, LNG. And Malaysia is by far a huge net exporter of this commodity and has not really been impacted by the developments. Contrast this with other countries in the region like Thailand or Japan or South Korea that are quite dependent on imports of oil and LNG from the Middle East and other parts of the world. They are more likely to feel the pinch in the short run. But I think Malaysia is, at least for now, fairly insulated from some of these developments.
But the air freight situation, the sea freight situation, we totally understand. But with the whole closure of certain airspaces because of what is happening in West Asia, having to now redirect, that surely is some added cost, right? Maybe you can take us through that sort of reasoning. In terms of the prospect of how Malaysia can navigate this.
Yeah. So I think the air routes we've not seen a complete blockade of the air routes, not to the same extent as the sea sort of blockade, and flights are already resuming over the Middle East. We haven't seen a total blockade just yet. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think because most of Malaysia's air freight in the E&E space, the electronic space, doesn't even fly over the Middle East because it's to the east. So I don't expect the immediate impact to be significant. So I think the vulnerability of air freight is not as significant as that of sea freight.
If I may, just to play the devil's advocate here, what would it take, how much or how long would it take for Malaysia to feel the pinch of the pressure from the conflict?
Just to try to understand some of the dynamics, I think again another potential for future concern is, say if oil prices remain elevated, perhaps beyond 110 US dollars. I think the levels that were last seen during the start of the Ukraine the crisis in the Ukraine, if we see elevated prices to that extent, actually it would be a kind of double-edged sword for Malaysia, because on the one hand we would see greater revenue in terms of oil royalties, in terms of excise, export duties, things like that. On petroleum, we could see I think according to some estimations, a 10% increase could lead to several million ringgit in additional revenue. But there's a cost, of course, in that it would raise the subsidy bill. It would put greater pressure on, our expenditure in terms of, having to then foot the bill for the subsidies.
Right.
We've already seen an increase in the unsubsidized price of RON 95, RON 97, as well as diesel. So the overall effect is ambiguous, but given that we are actually we're still a net exporter of fuel overall, but the trade balance is sort of slowly shifting towards net imports. We are increasingly becoming more of a importer than we are an exporter of, particularly of crude oil. And this could potentially then, we could see an instance where the subsidy bill could potentially outweigh the benefits in terms of the revenue. That is something that could be a concern in the long run.
Understood.
Okay.
Jaideep, I will get to you in terms of whether, say, if prices remain elevated, in what way would this impact Malaysia's competitiveness? But I'll go to Dr. Ferooze first, because obviously we understand that Malaysia, at the end of the day, we do not have direct trade with Iran, but apparently the country's exposure to other factors might, especially through global markets, might impact in terms of this particular logistical issues here lah. But again, ambiguity, political uncertainty, pushes or feeds this particular risk of perception, right? Unfortunately, in the whole psychological aspect of warfare, it threatens or scare away investors. In this particular case, right, do you think the Gulf states are already being forced to harden or pivot their relations, having to focus on the East and just do away with the West, or are they hardening their security measures and fortifying their support with US at play here?
There has been conversation about how currently majority of these GCC countries are running out of interceptors. Okay, and there's been a lot of diplomatic exchanges between these GCCs and United States that please replenish our missile stock. And the United States replied to them that, look, we are facing the same problem. Our missile stocks are, dwindling. As a matter of fact, Washington Post, I think a few days ago, reported that the US stock for missiles can only last for the most 1 to 2 months. Okay. So there's a problem here, okay? And the request by these GCCs, in one way or other, it's been rejected by United States for the reason that the answer is they need to replenish the stock for Israel. Now, with that being said, there's a conversation among these GCC policymakers on how much they can rely on the United States in terms of their overall security for the long term. Now, whether this sort of conversation will lead them to believe that they need an alternative partner other than United States, something which I'm unsure. But China certainly is looking to the region with interest over there. And also, as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan currently is having a national defense cooperation with Saudi Arabia. Maybe some sort of agreement can be made between Pakistan and other GCC countries. We don't know.
Right.
It is still trajectory at this point.
But China, there's a report here on Bloomberg apparently where China is unlikely to rally behind Iran just because, even though it's relying on Iran's 90% oil exports, because at the end of the day, the war or whatever's the escalation that's happening in the Middle East, it doesn't have an impact on their own sovereignty. China will only enter, or China will not be too, how do I say, premature to enter this particular war if it even requires them to do so, because they have other bigger fish to fry in that sense. But what does that say when it comes to alliances then? Because you would think that in situations like this, China and Russia would immediately step in.
Exactly. That has been a common perception, right? So China wouldn't want to go head on with the United States. They are keen to do the indirect way of helping. As I previously mentioned, before the start of the war, China has been helping Iran to replace its GPS system with Baidu system. Okay, it is a military grade based system to track stealth fighters. Okay, and other than that, China has also been helping Iran in terms of its satellite system. There's one system called the Mizar Vision, which Iran has been using even before the war itself to track the path of United States Navy heading towards Iran, which in terms of where is their geolocation and etc. And including the flight path of the aircraft. China has been sharing that. And also during early this year, January 2026, there was a mass riot in Iran. United States sent over Starlink, and China helped by giving out a jamming system to the Iranian government to jam Starlink. So it is not the Iranian government that actually was able to jam Starlink, but it was able to jam Starlink using China's technology. So now going back to your question, there is a high chance where China will indirectly help Iran, but not in a way to portray itself to be in direct coalition with the United States.
Well, Beijing is set to see Washington in the form of Trump coming over for this sort of like bilateral talks. I think end of this month, it's going soon enough. What do you hope for that particular meeting how it would transpire, and how can Malaysia take cues from there? I mean, because I at the end of the day, we want to know how would this impact us as a country and the region in ASEAN in terms of how we can pivot this.
Yeah, I mean, Malaysia must take a non-aligned approach. We are in a difficult time at this point, and the only path towards navigating through is to refer back to our previous foreign policy framework, which has been set by Tun Abdul Razak, that is being non-aligned, being friendly with everybody, to talk with everybody else's for the sake of achieving our national interests.
Understood.
So I think the same formula should be applied with the current situation. Whomever that is at the world stage, be it, but what is more important is for us to focus on our priority and to be looking ways how can we navigate through the chaos that we are seeing at this point.
Now we want to move into energy, trade, and industrial implications, right? Earlier I mentioned I want to get to Jaideep on how Malaysia can maintain its competitiveness, especially in the realm where prices keep on increasing, and if it remains elevated, how do we actually maintain our own domestic sort of supply chain here?
Yeah, whether the economic effects will become more entrenched or
Correct.
something like that. Yeah.
Correct. And in this particular case, right, we have to look at Malaysia's own industrial production cost. I mean, especially in not just manufacturing but also E&E. Jaideep, do you think this will alter certain priorities under the Malaysia's new industrial master plan here, the trajectory that we have till 2030? I mean, of course, we didn't expect a war, a regional war happening, not within our region, but everything has a ripple effect.
Sure. So I think to start with, I think it's important to kind of put the latest development in oil prices into context. So oil prices are higher than now, about 10 or so percent higher than they were, a few days ago. Yes, the short-term fluctuations are, inevitable. We have seen that time and again over the last few, crises, but they still remain significantly below peaks that were seen in 2022 during the Ukraine war. And I think also what's different is that was a multi-dimensional economic shock. It was both a supply shock, caused by the war, caused by shortages that were attributed to the war, but at the same time there was also a post-pandemic demand shock that further sort of put very considerable pressure on prices, which at that time for Malaysia at least led to a ballooning of the subsidy bill. This time it's a bit different because before there was in the run up to this crisis, prices were fairly stable. Even producer prices, if we look at the producer price index, so it's sort of the complement to the consumer price index, which we use to track inflation, but this is from the perspective of producers. It has not really, it has been fairly stable and actually has been quite low in the last few months. And also another important point is that in terms of monetary policy, inflation rates now are higher than they were, in the middle of 2022, which means, to put it simply, that the inflationary pressure is not that strong, at least not yet. And analysts do not expect it, any recessionary implications just yet. There may be a dampening of GDP by a few percentage points, particularly for countries that are very dependent, as I mentioned, Thailand and so on. But for Malaysia, at least, I do not expect to see a change in our industrial policy priorities, particularly because if you look at the new industrial master plan, at least 2 of the 4, overarching missions are in fact more relevant now than they were before. These are regarding the net zero transition, the transition to net zero, as well as safeguarding economic security. So the NIMP, calls also for greater investment into renewable energy technologies, into ways to decarbonize industries like the E&E industry, because the semiconductor industry is a major, consumer of energy, of electricity, of water, and the effort to decarbonize it, the need to decarbonize it has been recognized. And I think, if anything, this crisis only makes this, the industrial plan more relevant in the sense that we need to strengthen some of these capabilities. And I think another important point is that some of the goals in the new industrial master plan, the situation that's ongoing now doesn't alter some of the priorities. For instance, structural priorities like moving up the value chain, strengthening TVET, strengthening STEM capabilities, improving, the employability of our workforce. These are structural, long-term visions that I don't think would be affected in any way by the developments that are
It's still
going on.
pretty much very isolated. Not isolated, but still very domestic. Sort of efforts here, right? Like it can be contained.
Yeah.
Okay, but how about the margin pressures when it comes to the palm oil industry, though? Do we expect any sort of spike or changes up and down?
Again, I don't expect any sort of major shifts
Okay.
just yet.
Very
Again,
positive.
most of our largest, consumer of palm oil internationally, our largest destination of exports is India, and I don't expect trade flows between Malaysia and India to be altered by what's going on in the Middle East. Trade routes remain open. The Middle East does consume some of our palm oil, but it's not a major consumer. So I don't expect that to be a major.
And with the campaign that they've been clacking down on our own palm oil, right? The whole misinformation on our own palm oil in the western parts of the world, then we don't have anything to worry about. lah.
But if I may circle back on the part about the concern about the elevated pricing of crude oil, because I'm not sure whether this is a relevant topic to discuss, but reform subsidies. Is that still possible? Is that still in the picture, in the pipeline, if this were to prolong? Because then we're concerned to elevated prices. There's also concern whether it will feed into transportation, our electricity generation, our food distribution expenses, And when that happens, then it will affect people on the ground, people like us. Businesses might have to initially absorb higher costs of all this ripple effect from the elevated prices. What do you think? Is it even reform subsidies in the picture?
So, for now, what we've heard from the government is that the government still plans to maintain the, RON 95 subsidy, at least for the foreseeable future. But, the government has also talked about, potentially continuing its effort to rationalize the subsidies. And I think the BTH 95 initiative that was announced last year was just the first step in a multi-year plan. Although it's not quite clear what the trajectory of this plan is, but I think if there is greater pressure on government coffers, on finances because of the ballooning subsidy bill, assuming again that prices stay elevated, then I think it would put greater pressure to perhaps reduce the subsidy at least gradually, because I think the government's quite conscious of the potential, inflationary and cost pressures that higher the knock-on effects essentially of higher energy prices, higher fuel prices. So I think the government is taking a cautious step and still monitoring what the situation. And I think so far, at least, things still seem to
Let's hope we don't get there.
yeah.
Well, yeah, Dr. Ferooze, I mean, earlier we discussed a little bit about, how this particular regional tension in the Middle East might have realigned certain, nations to certain powers, right? Certain superpowers. Probably nothing is set in stone yet. However, again, if this confrontation is prolonged, do you think Malaysia should balance the relationship between both the Western and the Muslim world in a more sort of visible and real?
Yeah.
The expectations meet the reality of today because it's very idealistic up to this point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To what extent can we actually just maintain the centrality here? Because the thing that happened in the Middle East is a breach of sovereignty
Yeah,
at
exactly.
the end of the day.
It's a very difficult question to answer. Look, Malaysia's relationship with other Muslim countries is largely shaped by its OIC membership, right? And OIC is being headed by Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a close ally of the United States.
Yep.
So if, by de facto, if Malaysia follows through OIC's policy, we are indirectly also following Saudi Arabia, therefore some sort of US policy on this issue. Malaysia, certainly now, we are caught in a quagmire right now. And therefore, I mean, it becomes very important for us to fall back to the idea of non-aligned here.
Okay.
Okay, so we need to talk with everybody.
Okay.
We need to be friends with everybody for the fact that we want to achieve our national interests. Look, this situation, if it goes more than 2 months, let's say, hypothetically, right? 2 to 3 months, it's going to affect a lot. Number one is the local Malay Muslim constituency here. We know at this point there is some sort of a stoppage of travel between Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. Therefore, it is affecting a lot of people keen on going to Umrah.
And certain trades, right? Economy is disrupted.
Exactly.
This-
What if, okay, I'm talking from a hypothetical perspective. What if this conflict extend up to the Hajj season?
Hmm.
I'm sure that there's going to be
More pressure.
groundswell by the Malay Muslim sector here on pushing the government to actually be more, what we call that, nimble in its foreign policy to navigate the interests of this group. So, I mean, this is where the importance of being non-aligned comes into the picture, because we need to get the respect of people. Yeah, instead of being factionalized between either A or B
Yeah, exactly.
approach.
But this particular prolonged conflict is also, has a lot of external vested interests, right? And we're just like a small fish in this pond again, having to like alter certain trajectory. For instance, like how can we at that table, how can we make our voices heard? Is it through a bloc, which is ASEAN, or is it through more negotiations through BRICS, because we're not part of the member yet?
Yeah.
No.
But with the whole attack here, I also don't know how BRICS are because like the alliance there is pretty now conflicting.
Yes, exactly.
So I just want to know, like, how can we ensure that we have a say at least?
At least.
Yeah.
I guess we can play the role of a small state mediator between GCC and also the Iranian government. Look, Oman is doing the same thing, right? Why
Okay.
not we replicate the work of Oman, or we collaborate with them? So one, it enhances our global image as a small state which is trying to empower its soft power. Second, it allows us to also control the discussion. Okay, so I mean, there are opportunities where we can look into and try to push forward our voice despite being a small country. I mean, there are ways to engage with these complexities, but it depends on how much our leaders are keen on investing in this sort of approach.
Right.
But of course, as you have just mentioned, it is a point for debate. Perhaps it can, become a form of discussion within policymakers.
Yeah. Looking at how, the soft power sort of approach, right?
Mm.
Negotiations and maybe aligning up with countries like Oman.
Exactly. These are small states, right? Small states. Militarily, they're not strong, but they try to increase soft power through bringing different factions together.
I know this is a little bit off topic a little bit, but because again the whole situation is developing, right? And now the focus seems to now be pushed towards the western part of that particular region where Syria, Iran, and now Turkey is also involved with the
Yeah.
whole context of NATO. But again, it's still very much premature.
Yeah.
But there is a regional spillover already, right? And we also know that Malaysia and Turkey has a very strong bilateral relation
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to defense, when it comes to trade as well. So is that also an avenue that we can amplify our voice as well?
Mhm.
I mean, Turkey again is a member of NATO.
Exactly.
I mean, and also a close ally to the US lah
Yeah.
in this sense. Even though they, on international front, they're not necessarily great with Israel, but they are neutral.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah. Look, I think Turkey wouldn't want also Iran to fall down. Okay. And secondly, Turkey knows that if Iran falls, Turkey will be the next. If you look into the reports a few weeks back, right? Israel former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, he mentioned that Turkey, as a matter of fact, is a greater threat to Israel than Iran. Okay. Now Turkey is working with its different groups inside Syria to overtake Syria, with the ambition of perhaps looking ways to create a buffer between Israel and Syria. Now, the thinking within the Tel Aviv policymakers is that Turkey is having this idea of wanting to reinvent its past glory of being the main regional power through the Uthmaniyah Empire. Okay, they are looking from that trajectory, and their thinking is that Turkey wants to use Syria as a nexus to reconquer Jerusalem. So
Yes.
such sort of discussion is inside Tel Aviv.
I mean, I cannot run away. I suppose we cannot run away from the fact that Tel Aviv's discussion has always been biblical to a certain extent.
Already, biblical is something of a surprise because when we talk about Israel being a modern state, but there's some element towards it.
Yeah, in its own asset. Yeah,
in
I understand.
biblical.
Right. Okay, well, now we shift the attention to Jaideep because, again, with the prolonged implication and instability in the Gulf, we a little bit discussed whether it will affect the influence of FDI flows in this particular part of the world. But would it create like Malaysia or at least ASEAN as a safe haven then? Would it actually create more opportunities for us with this thing? I know it's like very bad for us to say someone else is suffering, but we're actually reaping the benefits.
I mean, yeah, we shouldn't see it as a zero-sum game, but I mean, there are risks and there are potential opportunities. I mean, as you mentioned, because it's, I think Southeast Asia and particularly Malaysia has proved its mettle as a destination of a stable destination for FDI, and FDI flows have largely consistently increased in the last few years, despite especially after the pandemic, despite some shocks in the past. And also, I think what matters when it comes to FDI is not just the global situation, but also domestically, how stable the macroeconomic performance is, and the direction of policy making. And so far, we have seen clear suggestions of confidence in policy making. For instance, we have the new industrial master plan. We will see the launch of the new investment framework, new incentive framework, which is a way to attract FDI in a more strategic manner. So I believe it's being unveiled as we speak, like this month, and it's an attempt to pivot away from the past approach of a blanket tax holiday on all sort of FDI into something more strategic and more targeted. And this is something we will see more of in the coming months. But it shows that at least in terms of policy, there is policy certainty, there's policy continuity, and I think that's what investors look for. And that's in one way, how we could potentially benefit, so to speak, from the crisis. But also, if the crisis does escalate, the implications could be if we get into a situation where global demand is depressed, because of heightened cost pressures in other countries. For instance, let's say some of our major trading partners like China or some other countries in ASEAN, if they face a slowdown because of higher energy costs, even if we directly benefit being an exporter, I think potentially we could also suffer because of reduced demand for our own exports. So it's really hard to say right now which would prevail, but I think suffice to say that at least we're not in the immediate line of fire, at least, and I think that at least gives us some consolation.
And I don't think we can even be, because ASEAN itself, I mean, Malaysia being in Southeast Asia and ASEAN itself being a very like a cocktail of like culture, ideologies and everything. So it's very you cannot penetrate that easily as how you view the Gulf.
Strategically safe
In a way.
by
Yeah,
position of economy, position
Right.
of politics as well.
yeah, alignments, yeah.
So now, okay, let's assume that this Middle East conflict dust has settled, right? So what's next for Malaysia politically as well as economically? What can be expected?
Assuming the crisis is,
Yeah.
if it comes down.
Yeah.
Simmers down.
I think it just the crisis, however it develops, only reinforces the need to diversify, to strengthen diversification efforts. I don't just mean diversification in the sense of finding new trading partners. I mean, we have begun to do that through our ASEAN chairmanship, where we incidentally strengthen relations, at least try to strengthen relations with the GCC.
Yeah.
But also looking to other countries in the global south. We've strengthened ties with Brazil, we've strengthened ties with India. I think that should definitely continue. It's never a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket, especially given the vulnerabilities that we've seen, and also given an increasingly unpredictable Washington in terms of trade policy. It's also beneficial for us to continue to explore other markets. I think strengthening ties with ASEAN it continues to be relevant, just because it's our immediate neighbors. So if there are any supply chain shocks, they are less likely to be affected if we are talking about just the immediate region.
Yeah.
Costs
Right.
are just going to be lower by extension. So
Well, because we have that particular, avenue, right? The ASEAN Development Bank that we're actually going for. I mean, in terms of beefing it up, I think in the ASEAN sitting, we were talking about it, and even we were engaging with having more partners, how we can actually, make it more robust.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just seemed to die down after the whole summit. But it will take place in Philippines next. Let's see. So I don't know.
Dr. Ferooze, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah.
What's next for Malaysia?
What's next for Malaysia in terms of our economy?
Yeah,
and stuff?
after this Middle East conflict has
No, when you guys were having that conversation, it dawned upon me that perhaps Malaysia can use its good office to negotiate with Iran to actually allow some of its oil to pass through Hormuz. We still absorb Middle East oil from Oman and UAE, Saudi Arabia, right?
Yep.
So can we use our diplomatic office to negotiate for a special corridor for us to pass through Hormuz? China did that.
Yeah,
Why not Malaysia? It is all about thinking forward, right? Engaging with Iran. Look, we have quite a stable relationship with Iran.
yes, pretty
Okay.
much, yeah.
We are not factional as the Middle East GCC countries. So perhaps we can use that kind of positioning to talk to the Iranians. Because as we know now, IRGC is controlling the Strait of Hormuz. So this is one idea perhaps we can explore.
Well,
Interesting
in terms of the diplomatic sort of avenue, in terms of how we can actually also make sure that our supply chain does not necessarily get disrupted,
Exactly.
and basically not to further reduce or exacerbate the FDI flows, basically. I think that's the whole anxiety that when any war takes place, people from maybe the other part of the world now tend to become more a bit uneasy because we kind of overlook the implications of what happened in Ukraine, right? With certain commodities
Yes, indeed.
being
Of course, yeah.
impacted. So that's the thing, right? We unfortunately have come to the end of the episode. I mean, there's a lot more areas that we want to discuss, but I do have one last question that I do want to ask to each of our guests. Again, I think it echoes similarly to the question what Julie asked, but further in terms of what Middle East situation, the situation in Middle East has actually taught us. Do you look at it as more of a risk or more of an opportunity?
Me first.
Mhm.
Okay, I
Good
think
for the-
both. Risk in terms of our domestic constituencies. Okay, this is the work. This will be the work for our government and its ministries to look where how it can navigate the interests of our people abroad. So that's first. I mean, opportunities are the things that previously we have discussed about. Perhaps we can use this risk as a way of positioning Malaysia as a small state mediator, as Oman is currently doing, or Qatar. So I think there's a balance in this current chaos that we are inside. So it's all about how we look at the situation. Yeah.
Understood.
So we're quite 50-50 there.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing in that it's a double-edged sword for Malaysia because it's certainly the risks are there, and I think again Malaysia is in a slightly better position to navigate these risks in the short term because of lower exposure than many of the of our neighbors. So yes, the risks are there, but I think we can still manage for the time being. But then that in itself is an opportunity because relatively speaking, we are in a better position, in a more advantageous position because of our position as a net exporter of certain things like LNG, and also our less significant dependence on crude oil than many other countries. So it does create an opportunity, but all bets are off, right? If it does escalate, then perhaps the risks could outweigh the benefits. So we just have to wait and see, I think.
Maybe just briefly, because Malaysia's pretty interested with the whole Belt and Road sort of initiative, right, that China is driving. Say this particular conflict spills over to China and presses China, and until China has to come in and then having to forget about whatever existing engagement that they have other parts of the world, how would that implicate us? Or
Actually, in terms of Malaysia is a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, but actually our dependence on it, so to speak, is not not that significant compared to a lot of other countries, like a lot of countries in Africa like Zambia, a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia like Laos and so on. Malaysia, the most significant project is the East Coast railway link, which is almost completed. And I mean, I don't expect any sort of any of these developments to derail that project because it's almost done. So I don't envision a significant change in the trajectory of the the BRI for Malaysia, at least in the immediate future.
right, interesting. Just wanted to kind of lay it out there, lah, for anyone who wants to just throw it out and they're probably curious about it all, right?
To be honest, I kind of feel a bit more assured about what's going on with the conflict. We're not so much critically impacted negatively. At the same time, we're quite safe.
Definitely room to
Yeah,
navigate in terms
exactly.
of having to put our allies take in a not to say right lah, but in terms of the more strategic path.
Yeah, exactly. We're quite balanced, like in that sense. Let's just hope that this conflict doesn't go any further, like 1 or 2 months, and then we will have to invite these two guests again to come on board and reassess our previous conversation.
Like someone from the Iranian office as well, or the US embassy as well.
That would be perfect.
Yeah, there. So seriously, like having this discussion now through embassies, like away from the heat of the
I'm crossing my
conflict.
fingers so hard it
I
won't
think both of
happen.
them will decline, I guess. The invitation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to our audience for watching this particular episode and for staying true to us, of course. If you like to know more about the developments on the topic that we've talked about today, don't forget to follow us on NSA Online. it's not just developments on Iran, the region, here in Malaysia, as well as in other parts of the world. You'll definitely get that too. Before I end the show, I'd like to thank our guests on set. First up, of course, Dr. Ferooze Ali from the University of Sultan Zainal Abidin UNISA. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. I do appreciate your insights, Abby, to also give the perspective from a geopolitical perspective, because
Yeah.
then we understand the policy.
Yeah,
abroad.
in a holistic manner. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Jaideep, for being here with us today, providing your insight with us. Because there was a lot of, we covered pretty much a lot of conversation into different multiple
Economy,
optics
yeah.
of
Optics of today's topic, basically.
I mean, it's important because then we Malaysians need to understand the repercussion, how big is it, or even how minor is it, and then so that we can be able to navigate our daily life and not to be panic about something that's merely what do you call it? What's the word?
Distant or what?
Like
Noise.
yes, exactly.
No, I mean, I think the most important thing is that for us to not amplify other sort of information that is not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Adding on to the information warfare that is currently happening.
Yes.
Right now, because on social media it's like there's a lot of angles
Yeah,
to
exactly.
the story. So that is what we don't want
Exactly.
as journalists. Anyway, if you do like this particular episode, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to also turn on the notification bell if you haven't already. You'll not only get NSC Beyond the Headlines update, other NSC Online news reports will be delivered to you. Now follow us on our socials. We are on Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, as well as Threads. My name is Amalina Kamal,
And I'm Juliana.
and we'll see you next week.
Take care.